Malone High School History, 1972, Venture article, slideshow by Hugh Roundtree. The history of school in Malone dates back to 1912 when a 4- or 5-room building offering 9 grades opened on the site of the present Malone School. Mrs. John Langston became principal around Christmas, 1919. About 2 weeks after school closed in the summer of 1920, lightning struck the wooden building about 6 in the morning and it burned completely. In 1920-21, classes were held in 5 wooden houses on Smoky Row while a new 2-story brick building was constructed at the old site. The 2-story brick building, Malone High School, opened with 12 grades in 1921. It was used through graduation exercises for the class of 1959. The class of 1960 held graduation at the First Baptist Church, and the class of 1961 was the first to graduate in the auditorium of the present high school classroom building. Teaching with Mrs. Langston on Smoky Row during 1920-21 were Miss Myrtle Beavis, Mrs. Bosie Tuttle, Miss Clem Nichols and Miss Ruby Conrad. The makeshift school on Smoky Row is where Malone's basketball history began. According to Roy B. All, who ought to know since that is where his basketball career began, Mrs. Langston started the first basketball team in Malone. We didn't play anybody the first year but Greenwood. We played them 4 times and they beat us 3 times. According to Dalton Hagler, who graduated in 1927 and who served as Malone's assistant principal from 1930 to 1932 and as principal from 1934 to 1939, the principals have been L. F. Rutledge, 1921 to 1924, T. J. Macbeth, 1924 to 25, Father Brian, 1925 to 26, E. C. Merritt, 1926 to 27, L. L. Nurmi Elson, 1927 to 28, D. R. Allen, 1928 to 33, H. C. Harrison, 1933 to 34, Dalton Hagler, 1934 to 39, M. E. Stanfield, 1939 to 41, R. E. Brunson, 1941 to 67, and Homer Duell, 1967 to present. One of Hagler's favorite stories concerns a Mississippi boy, J. C. Halliburton, who was the first person to teach vocational agriculture at Malone High School in 1922. He got to courting a girl out here in the country and fell in love with her. When he asked her to marry him, she said no, that she didn't want to marry a poor old country school teacher who'd never amount to anything. So Halliburton left here and went into business with his brother in Oklahoma. Neither one of them ever married. And when Halliburton's brother died in 1969, leaving his share of the company to the poor old country boy, the Halliburton Company's net profits after taxes were $54 million. The first graduating class of Malone High School, 1922, consisted of 1 person, Edith Pender, a sister of Mrs. Lua Mae Johnson. Class of 1923, the first class to graduate from Malone High School in 1922 consisted of only 1 person, Edith Pender. But the class of 1923, pictured above on graduation day, had 5 students. They were, left to right, Johnny Daniels, Winnie McClure, Evelyn Chambliss, Vera Williams and Victor Beavis. Photos from the collection of Mrs. Vera Welch. The second graduating class, 1923, was 5 times as large as the first. The graduates were Victor Beavis, Vera Williams, Johnny Daniels, Evelyn Chambliss and Winnie McClure. In 1921, Hagler estimates, the school had 325 to 350 students in all 12 grades. By 1939, the enrollment was 530. Although a number of nearby schools, such as Central, Concord and Bascom, have been closed and the students sent to Malone, the 1972 enrollment is only 670. Through the years, the biggest graduating classes have been those of 1939 and 1969 with 38 students each, and the class of 1967 with 45 graduates. Hagler points out that Malone High School, which only had a football team for about 4 years after it began, produced an All-American, Jimmy Hitchcock. In 1926, when Hitchcock played for Malone, the team won 4 games and lost 3. Hitchcock became an All-American when he attended Auburn University. Later, he became a pro baseball player. Prior to 1930, children got to school the best way they could, but during that year, Jim Dewey began operating his own school bus. Until 1941, when E.T. Denmark became county school superintendent, the buses were privately owned, Hagler said, and the bus bodies were homemade. In the 20s, Hagler said, there was more school spirit at Malone High School than you'll ever see again. It was a privilege to attend school in those days, and families usually had to make a considerable sacrifice to pay the tuition. And the teachers, well, teaching was a calling. The teachers were as dedicated as ministers. They had to be, considering the low pay. During the 20s and early 30s, Malone High School had a student paper named The Peanut. A copy of the May 8, 1925, issue, which belongs to Mrs. Nita Williams, lists the following staff: Estelle Williams, Editor-in-Chief; Thelma M.C. Donald, Associate Editor; Dalton Algier, Business Manager; James Anderson, Advertising Manager; Floyd Fitch, Joke Editor; Mary Adams, Literary Editor; Kenneth Smith, Athletic Editor; Mabel Roundtree, Extra Editor; and Hetty Dell Hughes, Circulation Manager. In 1948, the school began publishing a newspaper again, called The Reflector. That year, Georgia Bell Avery was editor and Lyburn Edwards was assistant editor. The staff members were Lloyd M. Sigmund, Sue Murdoch, Bonnie Dunaway, Sonia Snipes, Mary Ruth Bell, Lois Mosley, June May, Lillian King, J.W. Jordan, Mary Elmon, and Virginia Baxter. 1923 Faculty. The faculty of Malone High School in 1923 was composed of, left to right, J.C. Halliburton, Miss Myrtle Beavis, Miss Corin Jones, and Principal L.F. Rutledge. The first yearbook, The Nightingale, was produced in 1930 with Cleveland as editor and Margaret Herring as associate editor. Other members of the staff were Aisha Calhoun, Frank Adams, Ben Burrows, Lolly Tidwell, Doris Beavis, Eleanor Olive, Bonnie Arnold, Phoebe Edens, Austin Conrad, Lucille Whitehurst, and Ellen Livingston. The Nightingale seems to have been discontinued after the 1930 issue, but in 1947-48, the yearbook resumed publication and has appeared annually ever since. The school had tried to organize a band in the mid-30s, but band did not become a regular part of the curriculum until the arrival of Albert Chena in about 1938. Virgil Oswald, the 1933 graduate who is now in his 25th year of teaching at Malone, began the first Glee Club in 1947. Anyone who ever saw Malone's original gymnasium is not likely to forget it. It was a white barn on which the county expended exactly nothing. The lumber was donated and the construction workers were local. Volunteers. The old gym was built in 1930 and replaced with the present brick gym in 1950. Perhaps basketball has never meant as much to any other school as to Malone. Roy B. All recalls that in the 20s, the teams played as many as 50 games in a season. Lots of boys went out for basketball because it was the main thing they could look forward to, B. All said. People didn't get to go much in those days, and the basketball trips were a luxury. Between 1920 and 1945, B. All recalls, Malone played 1,033 games and only lost 67. And because there were no size classifications then, the team played such schools as Miami, Tampa, Pensacola and Jacksonville. We beat Pensacola 20 out of 23 years, B. All said. Some of Malone's most glorious basketball years occurred between 1952 and 1964, when the home team won more Northwest Florida Conference championships against all size schools than any other team. Under Coach Homer Buell. The Tigers were victorious in 1957, 1959, 1960, 1961, and 1963. Of 6 state tournaments in which the Tigers participated, the team won the Class B championship 4 times in 1952, 1953, and 1954 under coach Jim Pavey, and in 1961 under coach Buell. From 1921 until 1945, Roy Buell was either the coach or the assistant coach, jobs for which he was never paid. The other coaches, through 1967, have been Bully Hitchcock, 1927-28, Rex Toole, 1928-29, G.C. Norman, 1929-41, Rosie Davis, 1946-47, Jim Pavey, 1948-54, and Homer Buell, 1954-67. Familiar building. Thousands of Malone students attended classes in this familiar two-story brick building. Before it was built in 1921, the town's school had only 9 grades. The last class to graduate in the auditorium on the second floor was in 1959,